Weapons are no doubt one of the most important assets to any Skyblock profile, because in order to tackle anything combat related in this game, you're going to need to carry some weapons on you. Whether it be for basic melee damage on a tier 4 Revenant or for teleporting around the hub island, weapons provide all sorts of great utility. However, due to the sheer number of different weapon options and upgrades in this game, knowing exactly what to go for, when to get it, and what for can be a little bit daunting. As a result, I've gone ahead and compiled a detailed list of every actually worthwhile weapon that you should go for to help progress your profile outside of dungeons. I will also be uploading the second part of this video that will cover dungeon weapon upgrades 2 weeks after this video goes live, because there is far too much content to cram into just one video. So now that you're clear on the purpose of today's video, I present to you the complete non-dungeons Hypixel Skyblock weapon progression guide. To start us off, I want to give a brief explanation of how I'll be structuring today's video. I will be covering the most optimal weapon progression model designed specifically for non-dungeon content. As mentioned in the introduction, I'll be creating a dungeon-specific weapon progression model in my next video, but that video won't be released until 2 weeks after this one. Next, I'll be splitting this video into 4 main sections: early game, mid game, late game, and end game weapon upgrades. I have also left timestamps on this video for every major section, so you can follow along much easier. And lastly, I'd also like to clarify that the labels of early, mid, late, and end game are very loosely defined and not supposed to be taken super literally, because the boundaries for what can be considered mid-game versus late game isn't very clear in the Skyblock community. I'm using these terms to break up the flow of the video into easier to understand chunks, but it's okay if you obtain some of these weapons way before or way after the recommended stages of the game, because everyone progresses differently based on how you choose to play the game. That being said, now that we've got that covered and out of the way, let's hop into the first major section of this video, early game weapon progression. So the first weapon that you'll want to get your hands on as soon as you start Hypixel Skyblock has most definitely got to be the Rogue Sword. The Rogue Sword is an excellent early game weapon because it's completely free and provides you with a really useful right-click ability. To obtain it, all you have to do is just talk to Jamie on the hub island, and after you complete his dialogue, he'll grant you with your very first weapon of your profile. This weapon completely sucks for damage though, so once you've gotten your hands on this, you'll likely want to pair it with any of the 3 starting melee weapons. These include the Undead Sword, Spider Sword, and the End Sword, which are all obtainable for less than 200 coins at the Weaponsmith NPC. With the help of these basic starting weapons, you should be able to comfortably reach Combat 12, where you'll be able to obtain your first proper melee weapon and your first proper ranged weapon. These 2 weapons are the Void Sword and the Dragon Shortbow, both excellent early game damaging options for all of your early game needs. Both of these weapons are obtained at different points of the End Island questline, which you can progress through when you talk to the Lone Adventurer. The Void Sword in particular can be a bit of an expensive upgrade, costing a solid 200,000 coins to obtain. But at this stage of the game, you should have access to some simple money-making methods that will easily help you obtain this. If you do find yourself struggling with anything related to this questline, you can always refer to the Hypixel Skyblock wiki for extra help, which I'll leave a link for in the description down below. In fact, if anything in this video is a little bit confusing or you'd like some extra clarification on it, you can always just check the wiki on the specific item you're trying to find, because that will also provide some extra information on the requirements of the item, what you can do to it, where it's obtained from, and other useful information. That being said, these 2 weapons will easily help you obtain your next utility weapon, the Aspect of the End, or the AOTE for short. Similar to the Rogue Sword, the AOTE has an amazing right-click ability, letting you teleport a few blocks in front of you at the cost of some of your mana. Getting your hands on one of these is really easy after you've gotten yourself a Void Sword, but whether you want to replace your Void Sword for the Aspect of the End will depend on your current gear. If you are dealing more damage with the Void Sword than you would be with your AOTE, then you'll want to keep the Void Sword and just use the AOTE for its mobility. But if you're dealing more damage with the Aspect of the End, then you can replace the Void Sword and use the AOTE for both damage and its right-click ability. An important thing to note about the AOTE is that it will last you all the way until the endgame stages of Skyblock, and I'll talk about why this is later on in the video. Nonetheless, once you've made the most out of this weapon upgrade, the final early game weapon upgrade you'll likely need to make will be the Aspect of the Dragons, or the AOTD for short. The AOTD is definitely a pretty tricky weapon to achieve for most early game players, but once you've got your hands on one, it makes your life substantially easier. This thing has very achievable requirements for the early game, amazing base damage stats, a great right-click ability, and it has really nice upgradability for the future. So you're going to want to stick to this thing for a good while. You don't want to get rid of your Aspect of the End though, as the right-click teleporting ability is still very useful to get around Hypixel Skyblock, so you should be dual-wielding these two weapons at this stage of the game. That being said, this concludes the entirety of the early game weapon progression, where you should be exiting the early game with an AOTD for melee damage, the Dragon Shortbow for range damage, and an AOTE for its utility. With the early game progression finished and out of the way, now we can start progressing into the mid game. The first weapon upgrade you'll want to make isn't actually a weapon itself, but an accessory to boost the current weapons you have. The accessory I'm talking about is the Dragon Fuse Glove, a very powerful equipment piece that fits into the glove and bracelet slot. This thing buffs the Aspect of the Dragons by giving it plus 35 base damage and plus 50 strength, which is enough to make it stronger than a large variety of popular mid-game weapons. This is an extremely cheap and easy to obtain upgrade, but it will make a huge difference to your dungeon performance, and it will let you go for the next weapon upgrade much easier. The mid-game really isn't that interesting in terms of big weapon progression upgrades, because the bulk of your damage in this section actually comes from how many talismans you have, your armor choices, and other aspects of your profile, not so much the weapon you're using. If you've completed all of those other steps correctly, you'll see a major increase in damage to both your Aspect of the Dragons and your Dragon Shortbow. And if you need help with increasing your damage, picking the right armor, or upgrading your talismans, I will leave links to some videos in the description below that should help you progress with that as well. Either way, AOTD and Dragon Fuse Glove will very comfortably push you to the next weapon upgrades for the mid game. Personally, I would suggest going for the Shadow Fury right after the AOTD, as the damage increase is substantially higher and it provides some great utility in the form of speed when you're holding it. The Shadow Fury's right-click ability can also be useful for secret routing inside of dungeons, but this usually requires a lot more game knowledge that most mid-game players won't have, so I wouldn't really buy it for this reason. That being said, the Shadow Fury isn't the only weapon you can upgrade to after the AOTD, as the other two notable weapon upgrades after the AOTD are the Bouquet of Lies or the Felthorn Reaper. From my testing, the Bouquet of Lies is a very strong contender to the Shadow Fury, with slightly lower base damage but comparable DPS. The Bouquet also has better clearing potential both inside and outside of dungeons, so if you're using it to kill mobs to spawn Slayer bosses for example, it's going to be much more efficient than the Shadow Fury. This does come with some drawbacks though, as the Bouquet's ability takes chunks of your health with every use, so generally I would consider this a higher skill cap weapon, and it isn't something that I can recommend to everybody. The Felthorn Reaper on the other hand is noticeably worse in terms of both single target damage and DPS compared to the Shadow Fury, but it comes with a much nicer right-click ability and it has +1 swing range. Some players will prefer to use this weapon because of the extra utility it provides, although it is important to note that it does fall a little short when it comes to simple damage. Overall, when it comes to an upgrade to the Aspect of the Dragons, it's really just personal preference between the Shadow Fury, Bouquet of Lies, and Felthorn Reaper, so you'll have to do a little bit of research yourself before you make up your final decision. I've actually done some pretty extensive tests on these weapons myself, so I'll leave links to those videos in the description below. Nonetheless, this final loadout concludes mid-game weapon progression. At this stage, you should be left with one of the three previously discussed melee weapons, a Dragon Shortbow for range damage, and an Aspect of the End for utility once again. Moving into the late game though, that Dragon Shortbow just isn't gonna cut it for range damage anymore. This is why the next upgrade to the Dragon Shortbow is the weapon that every Skyblock player raves about, the Juju Shortbow. I'm not going to go into too many details as to why you should get your hands on one of these, but long story short, it's an excellent dungeon weapon, an awesome ranged weapon outside of dungeons, and it's easily the most desired weapon amongst Skyblock players. Pairing the Juju Shortbow with a Shadow Fury, Bouquet of Lies, or a Felthorn Reaper will give you excellent melee and range damage for all parts of Skyblock, allowing you to continue to focus on armor upgrades, your talismans, and other general profile upgrades. The next weapon upgrade on this list is an interesting one though, because unlike the previous upgrades mentioned in this video, it only has one very specific use case, but a very important one at that. The weapon I'm talking about here is the Atom Split Katana, although you will first start with the Voidwalker Katana and then work your way up to the Atom Split, but you will want to get your hands on this weapon in the late game stages of Hypixel Skyblock. This is because the Atom Split Katana is the most affordable weapon you can use to reliably take out tier 4 Enderman Slayer bosses, which you will need to do to unlock your first endgame weapon. Aside from reliably killing tier 4 Enderman bosses, the Atom Split has no other proper uses in Skyblock, so you'll end up using your other melee weapons of choice to take out the other 3 Slayers. The Atom Split does help you obtain the next weapon upgrade in progression though, the Aspect of the Void, or the AOTV for short. The AOTV is a much stronger upgraded version of the AOTE, which is basically a must-have item when entering the late game. The AOTV has a lower mana cost for the ability, it's a shovel instead of a sword, and it allows you to attach an Etherwarp conduit, adding an entirely new ability to the AOTV. The requirements for this weapon are unlocked after reaching Enderman Slayer 6, but the Etherwarp conduit can only be crafted and applied once you reach Enderman Slayer 7. That being said, there aren't any requirements to actually use this weapon or the Etherwarp ability, so you can actually get someone with the requirements to make one for you and then just use that weapon instead. Depending on when you're watching this video though, this might get patched in the future, so just be wary of that as well. Either way, the AOTV is not a good damaging weapon at all, and its sole purpose is to serve as an extremely powerful utility item. If you're trying to level up your damage in general, you should look to upgrade into the next weapon in progression, the Giant Sword. Now, the Giant Sword is a very interesting weapon because it very heavily relies on your overall profile stats in order for it to actually be an upgrade. The reason I say this is because if you have more mid-game or early late game stats, the Shadow Fury is only very slightly worse than the Giant Sword. For reference, on one of my mid-game Skyblock profiles, the Shadow Fury deals 94,000 damage to a standard graveyard zombie, while a Giant Sword with the exact same enchant deals 106,000 damage. This damage difference of less than 15,000 really isn't that much of an upgrade at all. And when you consider the fact that the Giant Sword is 3 times as expensive as the Shadow Fury, it's clear that this just isn't an upgrade. However, when I do the exact same damage test using the same weapons on my endgame Skyblock profile, the Shadow Fury deals 930,000 damage, while the Giant Sword deals 1.2 million damage. This is a very significant boost in damage, and it's clear that the Giant Sword is an upgrade to the Shadow Fury if you have the stats to back it, but that's the most important part. You have to have good base stats for it to be viable. As a result, the Giant Sword only serves as an upgrade to the Shadow Fury once you've been in the late game for a while, and I'd recommend holding off from buying one until every other upgrade to your profile starts to become really expensive. With all that being said though, that concludes the late game weapon progression. Coming out of the late game, you should have yourself a Giant Sword for melee damage, a Juju Shortbow for range damage, and an AOTV with all possible upgrades to it as your utility weapon. This includes adding transmission tuners, the Etherwarp conduit I mentioned earlier, and ideally chuck on Ultimate Wise 5 as well to get the mana cost of your abilities cut in half. Moving into the endgame section of this video though, this is where things start to get a little bit controversial, particularly with what you should upgrade into first and what defines a late game or end game weapon. Now, this final segment of weapon progression is actually very simple. You have the Terminator, the Necron's Blade, and then the Dark Claymore. Now, the reason I've placed these 3 weapons into an endgame category is because they are the final weapons you can upgrade into at the time of recording this video. That being said, these weapons are often obtained by players that have been in the late game stage for a good while, So labeling these weapons as strictly endgame can be a little bit misleading. Either way, there's really not much to say here. The Terminator is by far the best bow in the game and can be used for all of your range needs across every part of Skyblock. The Necron's Blade is easily the greatest utility item and right-click mage weapon in this game, and it has 4 notable variants being the Hyperion, Valkyrie, Scylla, and Estrella. The variant you choose will be based on your needs and what you personally prefer, though most endgame players will argue that the Hyperion and the Estrella are the 2 best ones for endgame content. As for the Dark Claymore, this is the strongest melee weapon by far, and it completely outperforms the Giant Sword by a mile, but it's also very tricky to obtain, and this is the final upgrade you'll go for down this route. In terms of which of these weapons you should get first, this will come down to what you like doing the most. If you're a big fan of Crimson Isles content, then a Necron's Blade will be a major upgrade to your profile. But if you do a lot of dungeons, then a Terminator will probably be a smarter first endgame upgrade. Eventually, your goal should be to own both a Necron's Blade and a Terminator, as they're both extremely useful. And if you get much use out of it, a Dark Claymore will also be a very nice upgrade. These 3 endgame weapons are general damaging and utility weapons though, because the other endgame weapons that I have on this list are the Pyro Chaos and Death Ripper daggers. These are the Blaze Slayer specific daggers which you will need in order to efficiently farm tier 4 Blaze Slayer, but just like the Atom Split Katana, you'll first start with the basic Fire Dust and Twilight daggers and then work your way up as you progress through the game. Now these daggers are also sometimes obtained by players during the late game stages of their profile, but they are the final upgrade for the weapons used to beat the hardest Slayer in the game, and thus are often used by high level endgame players to reliably farm Blaze Slayer. And with all of that being said, that concludes the main weapon progression from early game all the way up until the end game. At the end of your weapon progression, you should be left using a Dark Claymore for regular melee damage, a Terminator for all of your range damage needs, a Necron's Blade for reliable mage damage and general utility, and an Aspect of the Void for added utility on top of that. Now this progression guide has only considered your main weapon progression thus far, which leads me onto the final section of this video, Miscellaneous Weapon Progression. While there is a fairly linear and straightforward weapon progression to follow inside of Hypixel Skyblock, there are also tons of other random niche and obscure weapons that you can also obtain along your Skyblock journey. Instead of awkwardly trying to fit them all into the main weapon progression outlined in this video though, I will instead list off a handful of the most popular and most useful ones in no particular order, with their costs and requirements for you to see. For the first set of random weapons I'd like to cover, I'm going to talk about the Revenant Slayer ones. These consist of the Wand of Healing, Wand of Mending, Wand of Restoration, and Wand of Atonement, all unlocked at Revenant Slayer 1, 3, 6, and 7 respectively. These weapons are extremely useful for survivability and provide excellent utility in all aspects of Hypixel Skyblock, and I'd highly recommend getting your hands on them as soon as possible. Similar to the Revenant Slayer ones, the Zombie Sword, Ornate Zombie Sword, and Florid Zombie Sword are also great healing items. All 3 of these have no requirements to use and just become progressively more expensive than the previous tier, and while you can dungeonize them, it doesn't actually increase the potency of the healing in any way. As a result, I'd highly recommend this as another useful healing item for you to use where you might find it handy. Next up on this list is the Endstone Sword, an item that lets you halve all incoming damage at the expense of all of your mana, while also making your next hit deal massive amounts of damage. This is a very cheap and useful weapon, particularly in the earlier stages of Skyblock, to tackle any mobs that you're struggling to tank comfortably. If you're not using a very mana-intensive setup, this is an extremely valuable trade-off, and once again, a weapon that I definitely recommend going for if it's something that you can see yourself getting value from. The indirect upgrade to the Endstone Sword is the Withercloak Sword though, because while this item has nothing to do with the Endstone Sword, its ability is very similar. Instead of reducing incoming damage by 50%, it makes you completely invincible instead, as long as you have the mana to sustain the damage. This item is unlocked after completing the Floor 7 dungeon, and it's extremely useful in so many areas of Skyblock, that I definitely recommend getting your hands on one of these the moment you can. The Ice Spray Wand and the Fire Freeze Staff are other useful weapons that you can obtain to help you out in this game. The reason I've put them together is because they both freeze enemies, just in slightly different ways. The Ice Spray Wand lets you shoot ice particles at your desired target, and if it isn't immune to the ability, it will freeze it in place, allowing you to take it out comfortably. The Fire Freeze Staff, on the other hand, will surround the user with black particles in a large circle for 5 seconds, and anything caught within the circle will be frozen for another 10. Both of these weapons can provide incredible utility if used correctly, and once again are excellent options whenever you're able to use them. And for the last weapon that I'll cover in today's video, I want to talk about the Fire Veil Wand. This weapon creates a ring of fire around your player, which allows you to light all mobs you walk into ablaze, dealing tons of damage over time. This item is super useful to just deal passive damage on top of the damage that you'll already be dealing with your main weapon, and sometimes it can actually be used as a really powerful crowd control weapon that's low effort, uses almost no mana, and is just really simple to use. All in all, if you are able to afford one, you have the requirements for it, and you can see some use from it, I would definitely recommend getting your hands on one of these. And with all of that being said, that's going to cover every bit of weapon progression that I had planned for this video. I've done my best to cover the most optimal progression for every stage of the game respectively, but with a video of this caliber, it's clear that I will have missed other possible weapon upgrades that I didn't mention in this video. If you do have any further notes that you'd like to add to this video, then feel free to add them in the comments below, and if you want any further clarification on why I've placed some weapons over others, you can check all of my detailed weapon comparisons in the description down below. Hopefully you did find this video useful, informative, or enjoyable in some way though, and if you did, consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. That does conclude everything that I did have for today's video though, so I'll catch you all in the next upload.